I'm Steve Wiggins, and this is the Groundworks Ministries podcast. Today we're reading from the book of Titus, chapter 2, so let's focus on verses 11 through 13. For the grace of God has appeared with salvation for all people, instructing us to deny godlessness and worldly lusts, and to live in a sensible, righteous, and godly way in the present age, while we wait for the blessed hope and the appearing of the glory of our great God and Savior, the Messiah, Jesus. Titus chapter 2, verses 11 through 13. There's an idea that is present in the church at large about God's grace, that it covers all sin and therefore it requires no accountability. I have friends who firmly believe this to the point where they distort God's grace by removing themselves from any level of godly accountability with other believers. And they live however they want. And when confronted about their lifestyles, well, then they answer in essence, God's grace covers all sin and it can't be revoked. And so while that statement is true about God's grace, my friends' attitudes do not reflect the heart of Jesus. Consider Jesus' words in John chapter 14, verse 21. He who has my commandments and keeps them is the one who loves me. And he who loves me will be loved by my Father, and I will love him and disclose myself to him. John 14, verse 21. So Paul instructs us to deny godlessness and worldly lust, and to live in a sensible and a righteous and godly way. So nowhere in that verse is a license to live apart from God's standard. The observable power of salvation in the believer's life is not fully displayed by the fact that we have been saved from God's wrath to come. It is mostly revealed to the world and that we have become changed. We are different people today than we used to be. That's why they call us converts, because we are changed. And that means that our desires to sin never fully go away to some extent, because we're always going to be in this flesh that just wants to serve itself. Christians aren't sinless, but should we not be sinning less and less as we grow in knowledge and in faith? No, those desires should be being replaced with the desire to please God. Salvation is not the ability to sin without consequence. It is more of a fresh start where we are freed to serve the Lord rightly. So to me, the sweetness of grace is displayed in today's passage. God's grace brings salvation for all people who would turn from their sin and receive it. And that's not to say that all people will be saved. Rather, salvation is offered and available to all people by grace through faith in Jesus' atonement for our sin. And it's still the individual's choice to respond to it. So those who recognize their need for God's grace and then they receive it, they enter into a joy which, quite frankly, is unexplainable. We who are receivers of His grace should desire to be givers of it as well. And in this way, we become living testimonies by virtue of our transformed lives, accompanied by the words of the gospel which we share. And lastly, we have the hope of grace, the grace of Jesus, because we acknowledge the deity of the Messiah. You see, later you should check out Micah chapter 5, verse 2, and Isaiah 9:6, both of them from the Hebrew prophets, speaking of how when the Messiah comes, that He will be God made flesh, that His goings forth are from eternity. Grace without deity is just a kind gesture. Deity without grace is unforgiving judgment. You see, we have hope because Jesus is both God and Savior. He is both just and the justifier of all who would surrender to Him. Have you surrendered to Him? If not, you should do so today. I'm Steve Wiggins, and this is the Groundworks Ministries podcast. Check us out at groundworksministries.com, because at our website, you could be led through the gospel and you could speak to the Lord yourself, and you could become saved today.